My name is Ceri Thomas. I'm a professionally trained artist, art historian and curator, and my role here in the gallery is as a guest curator. I've been looking at certain aspects of the collection, which is huge. So, you know, it can keep someone busy for years looking at this collection, or a number of people, but I've taken a particular focus, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The main title is Shaping Wales. The idea of shaping, that it's a kind of process, that Wales is kind of evolving. So the exhibition looks at activity of particularly two former curators of the gallery in the 1950s and 60s. And the first person that was in charge of the gallery also was head of the art school, which is over the road. But that is significant because over the last century, the exchange between the art school and the gallery is critical, really. In the mid-20th century, Swansea, I would argue, is culturally the most, in visual culture terms, is probably the most important centre in Wales. So that first person was called William Grant Murray. He had two jobs in effect, so we can't class him technically as the first full-time curator. So what I'm looking at is his two successors. So his first successor was called David Bell, and he arrived at the beginning of 1951. So he, as it turned out, ran the gallery throughout the 50s. His successor, she was here as it happened in the 60s. So really I'm looking at what did a male curator do in the 50s and a female curator in the 60s. And it's a fascinating story. I learnt a lot by engaging with the collection. David Bell, who was curator here in the 1950s, he was a trained painter. So what clearly emerges through looking at the Glynn Vivian collection is that he is very focused on collecting particularly painting and, if possible, by Welsh artists. Not exclusively, but certainly that. And you know, one of the other artists that he collected, there were obviously people like Augustus John, Innes and Catherine Williams, but they, if you like, were from elsewhere. They trained elsewhere. They were from Wales, but they trained elsewhere. But someone like this, Alfred James, did this beautiful still life from the 1930s, was trained here in Swansea. And in fact, Grant Murray inspired lots and lots of artists, some from working class backgrounds, some from middle class backgrounds. He would enable scholarship, so he was helping this shaping process. David Bell was a painter, painting pictures. He painted portraits, still lifes and landscapes. This is an example. This is Elizabeth Iorwerth, and she and her husband were great supporters of the gallery. They were personal friends of David Bell and his wife, and they also were personal friends of Kerry Richards. In fact, her husband and Kerry Richards knew each other since they were schoolboys. They grew up in the same village. What we have here is an early self-portrait by David Bell. He'd only been in his 20s doing that. He came from quite an intellectual family, quite academic, and his two brothers went to uni. And when the young David Bell announced to his parents that he wanted to go to art school, they were quite worried, mainly because of job insecurity, which is very familiar to us all now. But then there wasn't a welfare state, so there wasn't a kind of a safety net. But they could see he was determined, so he did go to art school. And this is him as a young, slightly moody student, maybe. So this is long before he is curator here, but it gives a kind of context. And another context is this drawing he did, which is next to this self-portrait. This is of someone called Meta, and he met Meta on a boat in Genoa in the late 1930s. So we're on the verge of Hitler starting World War II. Certainly Hitler's in power, and Meta was Jewish. She and her sister were actually on that boat in Genoa, escaping occupied Europe, and they became extremely close, the two of them, because they both ended up back in Britain. David Bell was on the boat coming back from Northern Africa, actually. He'd been working as an archaeologist. recording Egyptian temples. So he's on his way home, and the reason he's on his way home again is because war is imminent. So for him it's just going home, and for Meta it's escaping home. And they both end up either in London or in North Wales. Their paths cross again and again. And in fact, there are lots of threads to do with the Jewish community and the disruption of World War II in the exhibition. Ceri Richards is a really significant artist, generally, in terms of 20th century Welsh art, but in terms of both the shaping of Wales by Bell and Armistead. And this is a very good earlier example by Ceri Richards. Like other artists that were in the exhibition, he trained in the art school across the road. His father was a tin plate worker, so in a sense, coming from quite modest backgrounds. And Richards goes on to represent not Wales, because Wales hadn't got that degree of recognition yet, but certainly he represented Britain at the Venice Biennale in the 60s. So he goes from humble beginnings and sort of projected with enthusiasm by Grant Murray. He becomes, well, he was passionate about art anyway, but he makes it, he becomes a big name. En route, in terms of the shaping happening here in Swansea, he encounters Dylan Thomas. He knew Dylan Thomas's writing first. In fact, he only ever met him once. Just before Dylan goes to America for what turns out to be his final poetry reading trip. And this was painted before that, but it was exhibited here in the Glynn Vivian as part of a collection of works when Dylan died suddenly in New York in 1953. But it dates towards the end of World War II, and the reason I'm mentioning Dylan is because it is inspired by a Dylan Thomas poem. It's one of Dylan's best known, perhaps one of his greatest poems. It's called The Force That Threw the Green Fuse. So that's the title. It's got a little suffix there, the source, because Richards did a series called The Force That Threw the Green Fuse, so they have slightly differing titles. And the poem goes on, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age. This idea of force, which Dylan is writing about, he writes the poem, unbelievably, when he's still a teenager. I think he's 19. He's publishing, by the time he's 20. It's amazing. A very powerful poem. I've thought a long time about this idea of force. And certainly in the 30s, one of the many connotations it has, as far as I can see, is this idea of, obviously, plant growth. That's the obvious one. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower. But the idea of driving a fuse suggests that it's more than just, the kind of imagery that Dylan is thinking about is more than botanical. And could it be electrical? Because in the 30s, in Swansea and elsewhere, it was the start of a conversion, probably here in the gallery. It must have been actually here, but certainly in homes, a shift from gas to electric. And Dylan certainly talks about the bubbling of the gas in his childhood home in Swansea, and this transition. So you've got this sort of energy. It's almost a bit like a fuse for a bomb, or a firework. But there's that kind of power. And in this picture, we've got what you call the fuse motif. So it's this axis line with these various forms of, they're certainly botanical. I think they're also anatomical, these things, these elements. And you've got this kind of cyclical process that is happening. It's called the source, so you do have the water here, and you do have the horse. There is that saying I'm reminded of, you can lead a horse to water. But in this case, this horse can't be held back from getting to the water. So it's this urge to be alive, to grow, to procreate. You've got vine and grapes here. So there's the kind of mingling of plant, mineral, animal. It's a very kind of imaginative picture. The picture was actually bought long before it came to be in the gallery by Dr Ceri and his wife, Mrs Ceri, who were great patrons of the gallery. Dr Ceri was actually a medical doctor by profession, and he and Kerry Richards had grown up together, so there's a very, very strong bond. And Richards, as I say, is a really important thread running through the acquiring of work by Bell and the acquiring work of Armistead. This exhibition, Shaping Wales, here in the Glynn Vivian, which looks at Bell and Armistead, it's because it's covering what their activities were here in the gallery in Swansea and in Wales in the 50s and 60s. It's perhaps no surprise that other themes, other threads, other social, cultural things begin to surface when I was looking at the collection here and selecting works. And this is really illustrated with the work of Joseph Herman, which we see here with his painting of two miners in South Wales. And the kind of thread that is here, it's not so much, I mean, it is partly that this is Welsh environment, so in that sense it is Welsh painting, but as the name suggests, Joseph Herman, or as he would have said it, Joseph Herman, it doesn't sound very Welsh. And he, of course, was born in continental Europe. He was born in Warsaw. He was Polish-Jewish. So here we have another example of this thread of Jewish communities ending up contributing. So there's like this theme of immigrants that is so important now. The immigrant, if you like, contribution to the culture of Wales, the culture of Britain. Herman arrives in this country in the middle of the war. He's escaped occupied Europe. His work was classed as degenerate. This is what the Nazis described avant-garde work as, degenerate. And the fact he was Jewish meant he was doubly degenerate. So he manages to escape with his life to Britain in 1940. 2 years later, he gets a letter from the Red Cross to say all his family have been exterminated in prisoner of war camps. So he's got survivor guilt as well. He's very driven as an artist. 2 years later, again in 1944, he decides, on a whim almost really, he married a Scottish woman here in Scotland, surprisingly, and they decided just to go on a bit of a tour, and they ended up in mid-Wales. They ended up in Brecon, and apparently he caused a bit of a stir, a bit of a chuckle when he asked where are the coal mines. Because of course he wasn't familiar with the geology, you know, there is no coal in Brecon. So he was directed to the upper Swansea Valley. The Glynn Vivian's at the bottom end, he was directed to the top end to a place called Gunlais, and this is where he encountered the Welsh miner that he was searching for. His thematic had already been the manual labourer. His father had been a cobbler, so he'd used his hands. And memorably, Herman says, I arrived for a fortnight, and he was coming on holiday, and I stayed for 11 years. It's phenomenal. So he makes a huge contribution to art in Wales, and the kind of European style that he brings is expressionism. That's what we're seeing here. It is an expressionist picture. It's continental European, but it's also Welsh in terms of its content. And he and David Bell became very close. They became friends. They were both painters, of course. Herman spoke multiple languages, as did David Bell. He was already sympathetic to the Jewish community. His parents had taken in Jewish intellectuals. David Bell himself had befriended Meta Gutmann, and now he had this new friend in Joseph Herman. With the advent of Kathleen Armistead at the Glynn Vivian, it's funny how things work out. It's very neat for me as a curator that we are shifting into the 60s. She arrives right at the beginning of 1960, and really, you know, the 60s, it's been talked about a lot, hasn't it, in terms of art and society, but it really is marking a shift from a more realistic approach, if you like, the Welsh environment, Welsh painting that David Bell was encouraging. He died at the end of earlier on in 1959, so he never saw the 60s. But Armistead now comes in the early 60s, and this is where you can see in Swansea and the wider context that movement, stylistic movement is actually happening. And here's a good example of that from here in Swansea, if you like. This is by Alfred James, and by this time his style has changed. It's actually 1959, so the shift is beginning a fraction earlier, but this comes into the collection in the 60s. This comes in with the advent, as I say, of Kathleen Armistead. And superficially, when you look at it, it's an abstract picture. It's really still transitional. James pushes it even further in subsequent decades. So there are motifs in it. It's actually based on a Dylan Thomas piece of writing, Dylan Thomas's prologue. It's called Chirp with Fruit. And if you start looking at it, chirp suggests birds. There are birds in there, and there is fruit. But it's kind of exploded. I think you can sort of see it in terms of the work of the American abstract expressionists. In the year he painted it, 1959, there was the first really big exhibition of American abstract art at the Tate. And James was very much aware of what was happening in the London art scene. He'd trained in London, and I'm sure he certainly mentioned to me the American abstract expressionist as something he's aware of. He's fascinated, again, there's a sense of pattern, which perhaps goes back to his earlier work, but it's a very different pattern. Whereas before it was a kind of more descriptive in some ways, tonally, this is more invented, and although there are linear elements, they're much freer. It's a freer kind of work, and in fact some bits are quite explosive. If you look, you can see some sort of scribbly, almost, paintwork, which might remind us of people like Jackson Pollock. The 1960s then was the shift to abstraction, and Armistead this is something she's very interested in. I think maybe partly because she was musically trained, and there is certainly a connection between art and music, and perhaps a more abstract approach. So at the top here we have a work by Eric Malthouse. Again, there's a strong Welsh connection. Malthouse was actually coming from Cardiff School of Art. He was a lecturer there. He arrived towards the end of the war, so again the war changing the personnel, changing the approaches. Originally from Birmingham, he's in Cardiff. He actually succeeds Kerry Richards, who taught at Cardiff in the war, in the Second World War, and he succeeds him when Kerry Richards then returns to London. The Blitz is over, so Richards can go back and do some teaching in the London colleges, and Eric Malthouse comes from Birmingham to teach in Cardiff. That's end of war. Move forward a few years, 10 years, and he, with a number of other artists, sets up something called the 56 Group. And yeah, you guessed it, it was established in 1956, which was a significant moment because this is the first group in Wales that wants to be overtly avant-garde, and within a few years are moving to abstraction. This piece is called Oriel. I think you can see it in terms of abstract art, but also pop art. You can see it in terms of the kind of British abstract and pop artists, but also in terms of the American abstract and pop artists. It is really international, and it's a huge shift from his earlier work, which was very kind of traditional. Underneath, we have, it's quite surprising for me, it's a Henry Moore. The shapes are very much Henry Moore, but his use of colour, again from the 60s, so the 60s is the explosion of colour. They talked about the 50s as black and white and the 60s as colour, and you can sort of see, certainly colour becomes a bigger factor. So I've never seen such a colourful Henry Moore before. What Armistead wanted, because her two big passions, apart from her music background, were abstraction in paint, but also in three dimensions. She loved the sculptural form as well, and her hope had been to get a Henry Moore sculpture into the collection. But Henry Moore, by the 60s, was such a big name that the gallery just couldn't raise the funds. But what they did do was they got this. So I think that introduces another aspect, that when we look around the exhibition, we need to remember that the curators, yes, they're making informed choices, but also they've got to think about the cost of things as well. So we have the two-dimensional work, which is a fascinating addition to the collection. And as I say, it's more using colour, so there's a nice connection between, I think, painting and sculpture. This big, beautiful painting is by Ceri Richards, and again, what we're seeing here is his, like so many of the artists in the exhibition, we're seeing a shift, constant shift and development of style. And Richards, by this point, it's painted in 1960, is really moving into a more sophisticated abstraction. In some of the earlier work, you still see the motif of the figure, and here it isn't there anymore. One way I think into this picture, I mean, it's this beautiful mix of sandy colours and blues, is the title. The title does actually help. It's a French title, La Cathédrale Engloutie, which means the submerged cathedral. So once you've got those words, submerged, we can see the kind of marine references. You know, maybe that's the surface of the water, the straight lines across the top, and maybe these circular forms and large shapes are fragments of the submerged cathedral. But another way to consider this work is the fact, again going back to that title and what we're looking at and its abstraction, is that La Cathédrale Engloutie is actually a piece of music. It's by Debussy, and what we're seeing, remember that Armistead was a great lover of music. She was a professionally trained pianist, and Ceri Richards, as it happens, was also a very accomplished pianist. So there is this strengthening bond between the sort of inner eye world. When we listen to a piece of music, we can perhaps see things, and this kind of painting, that maybe when we see this, we can hear things. It's a kind of what we call synesthesia, this crossover between the world of sound and the world of the image. I think it's a beautiful piece. Debussy was French, so again it reminds us that the importance of continental European culture as an influence on Welsh art. And the other thing to say is that he moves into this series, I think partly as a response of the big exhibitions of American abstract art that are coming into Britain, and the increase of abstract art in St Ives and that whole area of the southwest of England. And for several years he's doing this suite of works along these lines. This exhibition is called Shaping Wales, but we mustn't think of that too narrowly or too literally. So yes, there are a lot of Welsh artists in the exhibition, and in the 50s they're working in a more environmental, realist, they're working from the motif, from the observed. In the 60s they're working more imaginatively, but alongside them there is not only their sensibility of art from elsewhere, but it is artists from elsewhere that the two curators, Bell and Armistead, wished to bring in. Perhaps Armistead even more so. I mean, the 60s was another decade, so it was more international anyway. And here's an example of it. This work is by caffael. Again, you can tell from the name that probably not Welsh. A Dutch artist. It's dated to 1956, and he was part of a group known as Cobra, which was a collection of artists from various parts of continental Europe. Obviously, Apple in his case was from Holland, some of the others were from other parts of Copenhagen, so there's a Danish element, various. Amsterdam was the A in the Cobra. But what's significant is just this kind of gestural way of working. And in fact, the very last article, the very last conversation and article that David Bell did before he died in 1959 was talking about Carol Apple and saying how he would like his work to come into the collection. But public taste, even though the gallery was pushing public taste, they still, certainly the public of Swansea and probably in Wales more generally, weren't up to speed with this kind of work at that point in the 50s. So it takes, 5 years later, that when Armistead is in post, she has another go at this, and she's successful in getting the gallery, with the help of the friends of the Glynn Vivian, they acquire this work.
And it's an example, first example really, of international art from a Dutch artist coming into the collection, Karel Appel. If I had to name one acquisition by Armistead in the 60s, this would be it. This is Barbara Hepworth. So whereas she didn't succeed in getting a Henry Moore, who was from Yorkshire, she did get Barbara Hepworth, also from Yorkshire, as indeed Kathleen Armistead herself was. So there are all these kind of layers for her. She loved abstraction, she loved sculpture, she was a Yorkshire woman, and here was a work by a Yorkshire woman who, you know, Hepworth and Moore were sort of emerging at the same time, and at that time Moore was the bigger name, but I think history's shown that Hepworth is just as significant. So Armistead was really determined and keen to get a piece by her, and she raised the money, and it was, you know, no mean feat. This is a work from the early 60s. It was actually shown in a group exhibition that toured Wales by the Arts Council, an exhibition called Sculpture 1961. That's the title of the show. And in it, there was this Hepworth. So immediately, she's in touch with the artist and acquires it. So again, this shift to abstraction. It's an inner form, as the title suggests, enclosed by an outer form, and then Hepworth subtitles it anima. That word anima, to me, would suggest the idea of spirit, that there's some kind of entity that we're seeing here. Hepworth, although she was from Yorkshire, you know, by the time she's doing work like this, is well and truly settled in St Ives. So the motif of the coastline, you know, these swirling shapes, swirling waves, but also how perhaps harder materials, maybe rocks, can be fashioned and shaped by tidal action. These are the kind of inspirations that apply to Hepworth. And the fact, you know, that the gallery has got that. When Armistead was leaving the gallery, when she left because she was retiring, she reached the age of 65 in 1967, she said that she hoped she'd begun to transform the gallery, which had been developed under David Bell, but she hoped she'd taken it to another level by having artists of international standing and, you know, more experimental people like Hepworth. So Hepworth really ticked all the boxes. Standing in front of this sculpture is quite an unusual sensation, really. If we compare this work, a figurative work essentially, to say an abstract piece by Barbara Hepworth that Kathleen Armistead acquired, they're quite different creatures, almost literally. We had anima there with the Hepworth, which perhaps suggested spirit. This is a different type of spirit. It's spirit incarnate, it's in a body, and yet it's a very unusual body. If we look at the body, it would suggest male, and if we look at the head, it would suggest female. And I think one way of understanding that, I think this happens with more avant-garde art, the title will help us. So the title, if we look at the plinth, it says angel torso. And of course, you know, this has been a centuries-old debate, you know, are angels male or female? Or are they androgynous? Are they gender fluid? Which again will strike a chord for us in the 21st century, this idea that perhaps things are not quite as fixed as we think. So what Armistead wanted to do, she was determined to bring sculpture by international artists into the gallery, into the collection. Hepworth from Yorkshire, like herself, was an international name. Henry Moore, international, also from Yorkshire. In this case, as the name suggests, Jacob Epstein, not from Yorkshire, of Jewish origin. So again, this other thread that comes into the shaping of Wales is the Jewish contribution to the community. It's a bronze, it's a piece that he actually made in the 1920s, and then it was possibly slightly reworked, but maybe not. It was cast in the 1960s, and it's a major piece. When this Epstein was shown here in the gallery, and when the Hepworth was shown in the gallery, there were huge attendances here in Swansea.
I'm Christopher Hugh Bell, the younger son of David Bell, the curator of this gallery, between 1951 and his death in 59.
So Hugh, it's great to see you in the exhibition here again. I know we've been here several times, but I'm just wondering now, we're standing by your late father's painting of your mother, and also of your granddad, Sir Idris, who, I mean, both amazing people in their own ways. What do you think, perhaps your mum and your grandfather, and maybe also your father, would have made of the fact there is this exhibition here?
Well, as you know, my grandfather was a bit reluctant for my father to become an artist, but he relented in the end and was very supportive of him, as noted in the memorial exhibition booklet. My mother was obviously smitten by Dad, and I'm sure that the two of them would have been really very pleased to have the works exhibited. The only time that some of these works have previously been exhibited is in the memorial exhibition in 1961.
Yeah, it's a long time ago.
Very long time ago.
Yeah.
But I've looked after them very well.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh.
First and foremost, David Bell was my dad.
Yeah.
And I just accepted him for what he was. And I was aware that he never went anywhere without a walking stick. And there were times when he would not so much stumble, but he had difficulties in negotiating perhaps steps or stairways, but he was never really embarrassed by his disability or his disadvantage, and I'm just proud of him basically.